build a truly generational, world-class global AI company, you have to be out of SF. That statement is probably closer to the truth than further from it. Actually, I'm struggling to come up with answers as to how you incentivize that sort of a research culture, a risk appetite, so on and so forth in India.
The opportunity for impact was much greater than if it stayed in Europe and built something at the corners of the healthcare systems driven by the governments effectively. I would say that the role that a startup can play in the Indian space is much larger than in Europe.
Nurses, technicians, as well as enormous waiting times across the country, whether it is government or private setups. There is a lot that can be done in order to move people more efficiently, ensure that they're in and out, because the capacity that we have, while it is growing, and it's going to grow tremendously on the ground in India over the next 5 to 10 years, we're still going to be short in terms of the amount of healthcare infrastructure and professionals.
If you don't have either of these things, then it's going to be hard to actually get adoption and be successful. I would say...
Welcome everyone to Antler's AI series. We're excited to dive into new areas and new opportunities at the intersection of AI with education, health, consumer, and enterprise. This session is the health session. An earlier session before this, we covered education. I'm Nandini, for those of you who don't know. I run the Antler residency program here, and we're putting together the 6th cohort, and the applications are open only until the 24th of Jan. So please do apply. All details on the website. That said, I also take care of healthcare and D2C investments here at Antler. What I want to do today, we're focusing on AI and healthcare, and we have 3 incredible professionals here. Dr. Sathya Sriram, former CEO, Preventive Health at Apollo, Alessandro, who runs Even Health, and Shivam, who runs RedBrick AI. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us. It's good to hear from on-ground operators, considering we're on the other side of the table. I'd love to start with you, Alessandro, if I may. You've been working on AI and ML for a long time, 10 years plus, right? What was AI for you when you started way back in 2012-13, and what does it mean now, considering the momentum we've had, and how has that changed in terms of you building startups, in terms of the technology itself?
Absolutely, yeah. And thanks so much for having me on. So my PhD was on probabilistic machine learning. And so the focus of that was to sort of quantify uncertainty and making sure that we know, for instance, when models are wrong or when they're not likely to give us correct answers. I'd say that's still relevant, but obviously a lot has changed in the last 10 years. And now I think the dominance of deep learning has become even stronger, right? And so the complexity of these models has increased a lot. I think now it becomes a lot harder to have reliable estimates of uncertainty and have a grounding in probability for the kind of predictions that our models give us. So that's a sort of a general change for the field. For myself, I only started working on neural networks and reinforcement learning when I actually went to DeepMind back in 2019. And so that's when I started to be exposed a little bit more directly to those technologies. I would say the biggest change, at least for me personally, is that it went from being something that I was studying theoretically and playing around with to something that is now a tool, effectively, that I like to apply to various different things that we do at Even. And given that we do cover a lot of ground in terms of what we do in terms of healthcare at Even, yeah, it's a tool that's very effective for a lot of things. I'm sure we'll talk about it a little bit more later. But yeah, I think generally my relationship with it has changed in that it's now much more of a get a job done, and so I am more of a customer now, and that's also interesting because I have to, in a way, the sort of important decision here is to decide what things will I build myself and which things should I just get somebody else to do, right? That's a key aspect, and the temptation is to build everything yourself, but that's not necessarily always the right approach. Yeah, I'd say there's still a part of me that wishes that we kind of had a more interpretable approach to these models. I think especially in healthcare, that's very important. And I think, again, yeah, being able to quantify uncertainty is something that I think is going to be relevant going forward. And I think that more work will need to be done there. So I think maybe we'll, even though that's a part of my background that I've to some extent let go for now, I hope we get back to that as well.
A question to Dr. Sathya and Shivam as well, because we've been talking about AI in healthcare for a long, long time, right? Everyone's been talking of data models. Everyone's been talking about AI being possibly the reason healthcare will change. But that's been sort of slow. Dr. Sathya, do you want to take this first, and then maybe Shivam, you can talk about it?
So you're talking about the adoption of AI in healthcare and how slow that is.
Actual tangible impact that we can see on ground, right?
Yeah, I agree. I think the adoption isn't definitely keeping pace with sort of the innovation that we're seeing, right? And I think a few hypotheses on what could be driving that. One is the use cases that one is solving for. I think we need to bridge the gap between what is happening on the ground versus what is actually in the minds of technologists and coders, and find a way to bridge that gap much earlier in the design process, right? So I think that there's a lot of great work, but how it's actually applied on the ground, how it's actually used, there might be a gap there. I think the other area, while the models may exist, the big difference, at least perhaps in India, from the Indian context I can speak, is the access to large data sets in a way that allows truly accurate models to be built. It's one thing to actually train a model on a small data set, but how applicable is it, especially in a very large, diverse population as us? And the minute sort of you don't bring in that accuracy, then it sort of very quickly loses ground with a set of very hardcore professionals like doctors, right, who value accuracy above everything else. Here, lives are at stake. And therefore, it is very important to get the accuracy element. And I think one of at least my hypotheses is the lack of access to large data sets for technologists to be able to build accurate models right off the ground.
Shivam, this is right up your alley. You should talk to us about this.
Yeah. So
what RedBrick does. I'll come back to Even Health in a bit.
Yeah. So I mean, basically at RedBrick, we build data infrastructure for radiology companies to build artificial intelligence. So a company like Siemens or Philips, who make medical devices and are trying to build tools to automatically interpret those medical images, they use our platform to collect, assemble the data, annotate it, prepare the training data sets, and actually even specific to healthcare, get through some regulatory, approvals. Now, so I'd say in healthcare, the earliest use case and probably the most prominent one traditionally has been of radiology, and mostly it's been vision algorithms in radiology. I think the first FDA-cleared radiology AI algorithm was back in like 2014 or 2015. It's been a while, and if you look at the charts, I mean, it is up and to the right. So adoption is happening. Like every year, it's like growing at 60%. So there's lots and lots of interest in the industry and lots of new adoption. But I think generally healthcare, for many reasons, is a laggard in terms of adopting technology for good reason. And a very practical reason that we face, or like radiology companies face, is everything needs to be FDA cleared. Anytime you build software that's being used in the diagnosis of a patient, that needs to go through FDA clearance, and in some case, kind of a small clinical trial. So you can't just build an app and launch it, right? Like you have to kind of prove that it works, and it's an expensive endeavor to do that. So again, for all good reasons, but I think this regulatory pathways are one of the reasons that the adoption and deployment is slow. The other one in radiology specifically that doesn't get as much attention is there is no obvious payer of the AI service, right? So in the US, so RedBrick basically operates in the US market, not really in India. So I'm not too familiar with the dynamics in India, but in the US, healthcare is driven by insurance, right? Almost like, I mean, every American citizen has some sort of employer-based insurance, and then the insurance company pays for all services. Now, when a hospital buys a radiology AI tool, it's like unclear to the hospital, is the hospital going to pay for it? Is the insurance company going to pay for it? What happens when it doesn't work? Who's liable? So the commercials around artificial intelligence radiology are also like unclear right now. And I think, recently there have been some advances in that area where, insurance is reimbursing for the use of AI tools. And I think that'll really open up, I think, adoption as well.
The institutional response and a young startup builders response. Since we're with you, Shivam, I actually want to sort of trace your journey because you grew up in India, moved to the US and building RedBrick in the US, right? One of the things that we constantly hear is to build a true AI company in terms of both capital and in terms of true talent. The US is a great place to be, especially the Silicon Valley. In your experience of both of these ecosystems, I know your India ecosystem knowledge is a little rusty. What are the immediate sort of steps that people like us on the other side of the table who can provide that capital do to ensure that we can build generational companies out of India?
So, we went as a company. So my co-founder is American, and both of us went through about a year and a half ago, an exercise of okay, where are we going to move? Where are we going to set up shop? What are we going to do? And basically the two options that emerged were Bangalore and SF. And we decided to give Bangalore a shot. I mean, there's clear advantages of being able to build out of Bangalore. I mean, the talent pool, the cost advantage, so on and so forth. So we made that decision. And I think, unfortunately, what my feeling right now is that statement you said, to build a truly generational, world-class, global AI company, you have to be out of SF. That statement is probably closer to the truth than further from it. I'm talking about global scale AI companies, not AI companies building for the Indian market, right? Yeah. Obviously, if you're building for the Indian market, then you should be here. So as a company, RedBrick also, we're probably turning our sights a little bit towards SF. Now, while, for founders who are in India, I mean, I think there's many things you can do, obviously. And for investors to kind of improve that, I guess, provide a stimulant. I mean, I think it goes down to not having core research culture, and Alessandro might be able to speak to this. I mean, the research culture in the US and institutes like, DeepMind, Google is just, it's so prolific, right? And I actually am struggling to come up with answers as to how you incentivize that sort of a research culture, a risk appetite, so on and so forth in India. But I mean, whoever solves that problem will basically, solve the problem of building global AI companies from India.
I think almost all of us on the panel right here, sort of understand that. My husband's a scientist. Dr. Sathya has obviously spent a lot of time in the US getting her PhD. Alessandro, you're a PhD yourself from the UK, moved to India to set up Even. Take us through that journey. How did you land at Even as a problem statement? And your journey just from also addressing what Shivam's point was on the lack of research capabilities in India or depth of research capabilities in India.
Okay, yeah, I mean, there's a lot to go through, I guess. Just about my personal background. So I grew up in Italy, then did all my higher education in the UK. I was always interested in applications of AI, not just the research. So even before the PhD, I was working in a startup that was doing applied ML projects in a variety of industries. And I was always, I think, interested in healthcare specifically because it seems like, well, it is a laggard, like Shivam was saying, and so that means there's still opportunity, right, to drive that adoption, right? And obviously the stakes are high, and so if you want to have some kind of impact, it's a great domain to build in. How I ended up in India, I would say, at the cost of being a little sappy, is due to friendship mostly. So one of my co-founders, Matti, and I go way back. We've known each other since we were 11 years old in Italy. She had done a startup with my other co-founder, and that was when I was doing the PhD. And so when they were looking to start up again, that's when we decided to join forces. They got me sort of at the right time where I was deciding whether to go further into research or not. And I decided that at that point I wanted to do something more applied and in healthcare. And then, yeah, we just started looking into the Indian healthcare space, and it felt like the opportunity for impact was much greater than if we'd stayed in Europe and built, something at the corners of the healthcare systems driven by the governments effectively, right? So I would say that the role that a startup can play in the Indian space is much larger than in Europe. And so that was one of the big motivations. And then we felt that, the problem space of building the best health cover for India was definitely a meaningful one, and that really spoke to us. And so that's what really propelled us to move. On the depth of the research, I would say, if somebody, to some extent, I would say it did start with a few research groups, right, out of which OpenAI and DeepMind were spun out, right? So if I had to trace back the success of these companies, it does really seem like they were very kind of geographically constrained. Just that we're talking about like maybe 2, 3, 4 research groups that then got that critical mass of talent and also nurtured that talent. And so I definitely think India has all the engineering prowess to also scale them up, right? So I would say it has to come down to having a few research groups that are really strong on an international scale and that attract that talent, and then can potentially be spun out into also maybe more industry research groups, right? And I think capital will come, right? If the quality of the talent is there and the success from a research perspective happens, then the capital will follow. I think the only thing is that now the entry barriers for machine learning are much higher, right? I remember, when I was getting started 10 years ago, there was no such thing as a computational barrier. You could really just you could publish a paper at one of the top conferences running experiments that would take you a day to run, right? And now you're not going to do anything groundbreaking if you really do that, right? Or you might do it, but it may be more on the fringes, and the industry interest might be lower than if you're doing something in LLM space and so on. So yeah, it's some of it is also that there was a chance to do something exactly there, and maybe now it'll be interesting. I think that's why I'm so bullish on applications. I think there's still a lot of very interesting applications that are out there to be tapped, and a lot of opportunity there. And so maybe I would suggest that people look into something that's meaningful to them. And ultimately, we shouldn't forget that ML is an applied discipline. So to some extent, the reason I didn't continue with research is that I felt that at least my direction was getting a bit too theoretical. And I think even from a machine learning perspective, if you find a really meaningful problem and you develop the techniques to solve it, that's probably the most rewarding thing. And so that's maybe my suggestion for people, right? Find the application domain that means something to you.
Dr. Sathya, I want to sort of come to you. You worked in large institutions, obviously had a ton of internal projects, right? Do you think that with the current strides made in AI, apart from adoption, where do you see institutions like yours sort of unlock potential while startups are doing their own thing? In fact, in one of our communities, somebody asked this question saying a lot of AI projects end up being paid pilots by large institutions and then taper off, right? Where do you see the unlocking of potential at a larger scale that you operated in?
Yeah. So let me give 2 examples, right? One sort of what I'm going to give on the clinical side, where I think that there is an opportunity, and the other on operational efficiency, which is, again, a very important aspect for large institutions to ensure that they serve more people accurately, faster. So the first example around the clinical software, right? At Apollo, we built the AI cardiovascular disease risk score. Now, there are umpteen number of risk scores like this out there globally. However, what is different is that our population is so genetically different, and therefore applying the traditional risk scores that have been used in the Western countries may not directly apply here, right? And so this was a particular model that was built, again, using large data sets of working backwards from people who came to the emergency room with heart attacks and then saying, what are the different parameters that contributed to them showing up at the emergency room with a cardiac event in this time period. And there were almost 21 different parameters that actually work together in order to cause a particular heart event. And so it's a fairly robust AI model. The clinical application initially we thought was for doctors, right, to use for screening high, medium, and low risk. We turned around and found out that actually doctors do very well on that front based on their experience and don't believe that they necessarily need a model. After multiple rounds of discussions, turns out that the low risk, very easy to identify, right? You come back after 5 years, you're on a great track. People actually, doctors give them good, don't worry about it. High risk, also very easy to identify because you're almost like a ticking time bomb. Doctors are able to stratify that. Where we actually found applicability of this model is to identify the medium risk. Now, this from an institutional point of view is not a tomorrow's problem, right? I mean, not right tomorrow. It's 5 years out, potentially, for a medium risk to develop into a cardiac event. And they have the ability to wait that long because they're large institutions and therefore want to build relationships with these individuals, help them with their healthcare journey overall. And if they're able to make a positive difference in their life during this time, then they have something that healthcare providers are dying for, which is the trust of the individual, right? So that's an example of a clinical model and how in the institutional context, because there is the opportunities to sort of wait patiently for a long period of time, that that particular model worked well. Let me move a little bit on the operational side, right? I mean, there is a constant shortage of nurses, technicians, as well as enormous waiting times across the country, whether it is government or private setups. And I think that there is a lot that can be done in order to move people more efficiently, ensure that they're in and out, because the capacity that we have, while it is growing, and it's going to grow tremendously on the ground in India over the next 5 to 10 years, with so many people trying to put beds, we're still going to be short. We're still going to be short in terms of the amount of healthcare infrastructure and professionals that we have. And therefore, tools that actually help bring efficiency to a number of the operational workflows, I think are going to actually be useful for institutions. And again, here, there is an advantage commercially, right, Shivam, to be able to say, listen, I'm able to therefore get more people in, more people or faster out. And therefore, the institution themselves benefit. The problem here is it's not a sexy problem, right? It tends to be very structured operations and therefore needs individuals to be on the ground, and it's not the cool coding. And that may be therefore the challenge, right, to almost barrier to overcome amongst younger startups to tackle those, because there is a attraction to solve more sexy problems and more cutting edge problems rather than the more traditional, systematic, structured on the ground problems.
Got it. Alessandro and Shivam, if you can take turns in addressing what are those top consumer experiments, and Shivam, what are the experiments that you're running that what will RedBrick look like 5 years from now, considering the AI experiments you run. I know a couple from which is Even Steven and the AI Care Manager. So maybe you can take us to that, and then Shivam, what are the experiments you run?
Yeah, I can go first. So yeah, you mentioned Even Steven. That was our first experiment where we released a chatbot that could answer some basic medical queries, and that was also in a way an attempt to drive some process optimization, like Dr. Sathya was saying, because a lot of queries don't necessarily require that half an hour block with a clinician. And we saw that people then ended up engaging with it a lot and liked it because it was very accessible. It's on WhatsApp. And we see that as a way for us to scale up the engagement with customers and maybe help them track certain things that the care manager or the doctor has recommended, like their meals or their prescriptions. And we're also going to do that over AI calls. And that's also just about, in effect, scaling things up. One other thing that we've released recently and that's been received well is this thing, the Health Corner, which is a part of our app where people can have a bit of a overview of their health status by combining health reports from blood tests and so on, and also suggest what might be a good test for them, given certain parameters that were identified maybe in a blood test and that were arranged and so on. And to generally give people a space where they can be a bit more proactive about their health. And over time, we will combine that and integrate that with more risk scoring, because again, that gives a bit of a call to action for people. And we think that the risk scoring, ideally, if done well and explained well, can be given even to the individual, not just to the clinician. But I think generally, even has always been about integrating all aspects of care. And so if I look at the next 5 years, it won't just be adding features to the app, even though we'll definitely do that, but we are also opening hospitals now. And so, and we've been running clinics for about 1.5 years, OPD clinics. And so that's also another part of the puzzle that we want to empower with technology and where we want to add AI. And I think there's a lot of areas in hospitals where bias can creep in and mistakes can be made. And I think generally there's been discussions of how we can have sort of an AI co-pilot for hospitals. And I think that's an interesting idea. Can we, if everything is digitized, why not have something running in the background that is constantly checking any operational mistakes, any misdiagnoses, any issues? And that can go all the way down to surgeries and having computer vision assist or check that protocols are being followed and so on, right? So those are also things that we're interested and where we think AI can play a big role.
So, I mean, we are a infrastructure product, right? So we are not in the business of building an AI products, but kind of have to respond to major trends that are happening and help our customers more easily, build AI. So I'd say the major trends, especially over the last couple of years in radiology, from a technology perspective, have been two. I mean, they will not be surprising to anyone. The first one is there's now a huge focus on building foundational models for, image foundational models as well. So, for example, there was a big announcement last year where Meta released something called the segment anything algorithm. So there's a classic problem in computer vision to be able to segment an object in an image. It's used in like many different domains, but in radiology, basically what segmentation means is classifying each pixel or voxel when it's a 3D image belonging to a particular category. So you'll be able to count the number of pixels that belong to tumor and therefore can calculate the volume of a tumor. So Meta released this foundational model that can kind of, segment any object in any image, right? So one of the things that, our team has to do is respond to these kind of technology improvements and make them accessible in the radiology context. So, we took this Meta SAM and kind of created our own version of it called FAST, which is the Fast Automated Segmentation Tool, which works on specifically radiology images. And there's a number of other advancements like that under the domain of foundational models, right? So, and basically the end use case over here is helping our customers prepare data sets at really large scales and, so on and so forth. And then the second one is there's been a strong shift now from only image to like multimodal. So in the radiology context, I mean, there's two modalities that are common. One is you have the image and then you have the radiology report. And, this acts as sort of a self-supervised kind of learning regime. So a lot of customers are now, not only wanting to train classification or segmentation algorithms, but they're building these large-scale multimodal algorithms. So again, as an infrastructure product, we need to prepare for that and help enable it. And And I think I just wanted to enforce the point that I guess both of you made it, which is there's like a lot of opportunity in quote unquote unsexy areas of healthcare, and which have traditionally been unsolved in operations and administrative, administrative side of healthcare. And I think they haven't been solved, not only because they're unsexy, they also are like really, really hard to solve. I think once you take like a deeper look into these problems, they're like high variance problems. You have to deal with a bunch of different scenarios, and each, administrative process in a hospital requires some human reasoning. So it's like, actually, when it comes down to it, a very challenging problem to automate. And we can talk more about that, but I think with large language models, we're probably entering a time when, for the first time, you can actually meaningfully solve some administrative and operational problems in hospitals.
Well, I think all of your points raised so many small gaps that a lot of budding founders here can take note of. I want to ask the elephant in the room kind of question, considering the audience. Dr. Sathya, we can start with you first. What are those areas or opportunities that founders should be building in at the intersection of AI and healthcare that you would personally invest in, and that you would personally definitely think there is a gap, and it'll also result in higher adoption?
So I think the first thing I would keep in mind, Nandini, is a little bit of a principle, right? We talked at the beginning of this session about how a number of the AI tools in healthcare in India are taking time to adopt. And therefore, from a principle perspective, it's important to build tools or decide early who you're building for, right? If you're building for a global market, then as Shivam said, there's a very different setup one has to think about in the problems and use cases. Versus if you're building for the India market, then definitely take a long-term view, right? And find the right use cases. I do think there is, in my mind, the immediate problems that people are dealing with that can, or rather generate returns very quickly, because there is a lot of skepticism around whether AI will benefit healthcare providers commercially, or is it just a fad that's going to come and go? And therefore, how quickly is one able to show and deliver returns? It could be something as simple as, well, it may not be simple, but definitely something as simple as training for nurses and radiologists, right? I mean, how much can we actually use that in order to fasten and hasten the space of training? Because the reality is nurse churn is high. Technicians are hard to find. And therefore, if you're going to just embrace that trend and not fight it, then what kind of tools can you actually have using AI that can ensure that their training is very quick and much faster and get them on the floors and productive earlier than later? So again, an example of something that I think has immediate and quick returns and may not be very complex to build out. Right? Another I think area is around the population health. Like I mentioned, there are many aspects of the Indian population that is very different. And so how can you work with either healthcare providers who have the large data sets or OEMs who will benefit from their hardware actually having a layer of software that will be relevant to the population and offer whoever they're selling their equipment to an additional advantage over everybody else. And so there might be an opportunity there to build clinical models for population that then finds a home very quickly in our ecosystem.
Thank you, Dr. Sathya. Alessandro, why don't you take us through what are those white spaces that you think that founders...
Sure. I mean, maybe other than just the application area, what I would say is that because adoption is so important and tricky in healthcare, is that I would maybe look out for somewhere where you have some distribution advantage, right? Where you know that to some extent you can, basically get the people to use it or to pay you for it. And that's very important. And if not, right, if distribution isn't something that you can crack easily, then consider something where you can have some amount of vertical integration where you are at least in control of the delivery, right? Whether that's sort of acquiring your own customers and doing fully B2C, and so you'll need to have something engaging, or whether that's having some facilities, right, out of which you can, deploy your own solution, right? I think you can have the best software and the best application area that we can suggest, but then if those two things are, if you don't have either of these things, then it's going to be hard to actually get adoption and be successful. I would say, I think, yeah, in terms of applications, honestly, I don't know if we split it into, I think there's maybe 4 main areas, I would say. One is like, or the admin stuff. And so there could be stuff around transcription and extracting and coding and standardization. That's something that, at least for me, is still a pain point and it's not solved. So if somebody did that well, it would save me some pain, right? And generally automation. Then generally around engagement and adherence, right? I think LLMs can be very useful for making sure that we do that and we are able to scale that and make up for the lack of trained personnel on this. And it's a very repetitive task. So I think it'll need some automation. Then risk quantification is a whole field on itself, right? There you do need a lot of data, though, as Dr. Sathya was saying. So again, there you need to make sure that you have some kind of competitive advantage in terms of data access. And then there's the more kind of deep diagnosis, right? Whether it's like detection of certain things from scans and radiology, or just from generally almost like in a primary care setting from symptoms, right? There's already some startups working on that, though. So maybe that's the one that's gonna sort of maybe the most initial interest from the ML community, right? The sort of diagnosis, right? But that's obviously a hugely interesting field. And then there's more far out stuff like, robotics for surgery and so on. And that's obviously valid, but maybe still a bit more long-term and needs a lot of capital. So yeah, maybe that's the way I would split it up. All require attention. There's a lot of stuff to be built in. Yeah.
Prioritization is harder in healthcare in a country like India.
Exactly.
Shivam, love to hear from you.
So I'll give my answer with the context of B2B and US, consumer, and India is like a whole other beast. So I think the probably primary problem to solve if you want to build, let's say, an AI product for healthcare in the US is the commercial problem. Most healthcare institutes or healthcare organizations in the US are private companies. At the end of the day, private hospitals or private clinics. I mean, there's like 150,000 primary care clinics in the US. It's like a ginormous number, and they're all like privately owned. So these are all either micro or macro entrepreneurs, right? So if you can make a compelling business case to them, I mean, AI, not AI, if it's like, I mean, they don't care really. They'll buy the thing, right? I think the trap a lot of AI companies fall into is they will automate 30% of 70% of the process. So it's like, if you kind of have to double check the work, and you can't just completely eliminate a certain process. For example, a lot of radiology tools, right? They'll perform detection, but let's say they'll pre-detect the nodules in a chest CT scan, but because of the FDA clearance, it has to be vetted by a radiologist. And there's like studies that say that actually takes a radiologist longer to do when they have to go and double check the work of an AI algorithm. So it's you're taking a big chunk and automating a little bit of that. I think much better than that is I think the art is in defining a problem that you can automate 100% of and provide some sort of clear commercial rationale for. So like I said, I'm very bullish, and I think there's a lot of promise in the administrative and operational side of healthcare in the US. So everything from, coding to billing to getting your claims, reimbursed, to there's an emergence of value-based care and helping hospitals reduce their cost of care. And it's actually an extremely vibrant market with very clear commercial incentives. And I think the stars are kind of aligned for language models specifically to contribute here. So I'd say a lot of people, when they think of healthcare AI, tend to think diagnostics. I think if you're doing that, that's fine, but realize that it's a very technically challenging thing to do, and you, to be successful, will have to have extremely good technology that's actually able to automate it and get FDA clearance, so on and so forth. But around the core diagnosis is, like there's a lot of value to be created. And actually, there's one doctor that I was having a conversation with in the US, and he was like, man, all you AI startups are trying to do doctor things. It's like, let me be a doctor, you automate the non-doctor things. Like there's so much non-doctor stuff that I have to do, and I don't know why no one's automating that. I'll do the doctor work.
My sister's a doctor, and she said the new threat is not patients looking at Google, but patients understanding AI and what it can do for them, because then I'm stuck here. But yeah, so we have a bunch of questions coming up, and I'm going to just very quickly pull up a few and ask them, right? Dr. Sathya Subhash is saying, on the clinical use case shared on solving for medium risk patients, how do you solve for such Indian patients' engagement who are naturally not very conscious about their health and only reach out to the doctor at a critical time?
It's a big challenge, right? And I think this goes back to what Shivam was saying, is the consumer market in India, a very different beast altogether. And I think naturally, the vast majority of the Indian consumer is not actively and proactively health conscious. I think this is a long road. And today we are not yet hit with the kind of medical bills that the consumer payer has to pay, and therefore not prioritized. I think the other challenge is that much of health is actually quite intangible until it becomes a symptom and a problem, right? And I think that's the beauty of our bodies, is it'll resist and fight everything that you're doing to it and keep trying to function until it breaks down one day. And that intangibility of it is the problem. I do think that making, therefore, tools that are tangible. So, Ali, you mentioned the risks scoring and so forth, right? While it's helpful in a niche way for clinicians, I think the bigger use case is actually finding ways to make it tangible for consumers so that they sit up and realize that this is the time to act. And how do you therefore find the right balance between ensuring that it's not fear-inducing, but it is inducing action instead, right? Because you want to find a way to ensure that the trust that is built to even take that score with you is maintained and heightened at the end of that. So it is a big problem to solve in terms of helping consumers be aware. I think the awareness has significantly shifted post-COVID. I do think as an industry, we have that to thank for. People are more attuned and more aware and asking more questions. And I think finding ways to be a credible responder to consumers, being able to build that trust and helping them with the tools in a very tangible way, in my view, is the path forward. Even that is likely to be a slow pace forward.
This is for Alessandro from Ashish, but I think both you and Dr. Sathya can address this. For a young startup trying to build an AI/ML solution for a particular niche, cardiology, autoimmune, GI, getting access to training data is particularly hard. Any advice on how to approach this? Dr. Sathya, if I may, just to add after Alessandro does, somebody else has asked a similar question on, are institutions like Apollo, for instance, open to working with young startups very early in their journey, obviously, for collaboration? So maybe, Alessandro, you can start first and then Sathya.
Yeah, I saw that question actually from Ashish. I would say actually probably Dr. Sathya is in a better position to answer, because I think obviously we could work with you, right, and try to help other startups, but we don't have the wealth of data, especially when it comes to specific conditions, given that the users that we have are generally a little bit after underwriting. And so there's not a huge amount of like chronic conditions, maybe more on the corporate side, but yeah, we don't have that much data ourselves. And so I would say that you would need to work with maybe government institutions and hospitals or private hospitals, right? And again, to go back to my or the answer to the previous question, that part is actually probably the most important part for your startup. Like, do you have some kind of distribution advantage? And in this case, by distribution, I actually mean like the access to data, right? That's the key. So I don't think there's necessarily a single approach, but yeah, leverage your contacts, leverage your family or whoever it is to get the right intro. We were shameless in the beginning, as every startup, like we just, we needed to get meetings with the hospitals to build a network and so on, and we got them through whatever means were available to us. But yeah, I'll leave it to Dr. Satya, who is probably knows what she's looking for.
I think the additional complication is also we are entering an era of data privacy, right? And regulations that are coming in the market in India that wasn't there before. And so that's going to add one more layer of complication and concerns from institutions to be able to partner outside. Of course, there are ways to do it, very smart ways to do it, but the approach and the has to include that. My own sense is it is highly unlikely that healthcare providers, vast majority of them are directly investing in the nimbleness and agility and tech capabilities that are going to be required to build efficient models, right? Not all of them are going to do it. So find the right set of healthcare providers and institutions. Large players may be doing this themselves or have the ability to partner with the Microsofts and the Googles and the DeepBrains and so forth, and so there might not be as much hunger, so to speak, to work with smaller startups, but there is a growing group of healthcare providers in India that is what I'm going to call reasonable scale, maybe more geographically focused and so forth, that are unlikely to invest in the tech capabilities that are going to be needed and unlikely to be on the radar of the large tech companies globally to be able to build solutions like this. So find those connections. And I think there you will find a good sweet spot of sufficient data and perhaps interest. But again, it's going to be very important to figure out what is the value proposition to the institution very quickly, right? That they actually see returns. If not, this is not going to have much meaning for them.
I have a question to Shivam and Alessandro. How open are US hospitals to trying new AI products to reduce cost? And would you build for mid-market hospitals or large ones which have ERPs and longer sales cycles?
This is all you, Shivam.
Yeah. So, I mean, to answer the first question, I mean, very open. Like I said, right? These hospitals in the US, they are privately owned. They are for-profit institutes. So, if usually when you sell to them, you're not selling to doctors. You're selling to a CIO. It's very much like an enterprise sale. Well, let's say an enterprise sale on hard mode because there's all the challenging stuff of healthcare piled on top of the enterprise challenges. So, I mean, there's no question that people are willing to, pay for things that reduce cost. I think the challenge and really the art is in coming up with the product that, can be adopted and will actually reduce cost and so on and so forth. Who to target, large/small, is, I mean, goes back to Alessandro's point on my first preference would be in one where you have a distribution advantage. So let's say you are a person who knows a lot of physicians in the US, or your parents have physician friends in the US and they own small clinics. I mean, start with small primary care clinics as your first customer set, right? Because I mean, the nuances of healthcare are ample, and you will likely need a large number or a few design customers to really get a product that's extremely good. So wherever you can get that set of customers, go there first. We can have a philosophical argument about but the ACV and this, that, and the other. None of that matters if you can't get access to a large hospital. So just go and get the customer that's accessible to you.
Privilege comes up again. But that said, what are the data privacy rules and guidelines for sharing healthcare data for AI models? Any of you can take this?
So I can answer on the context of the US. So, sure. Well, in the US and the Europe, actually, so we operate in both spaces. They have different laws. So the privacy law in the US is HIPAA, and the one in Europe is GDPR. So these govern basically the use of patient data, and it to us personally has not been like people starting RedBrick. I feel like this was the most common question I got, which was like, oh my God, data privacy, how are you going to build? You have all this patient data. But it's not like something that's been a problem. There are many companies that build products, that involve patient data. There are EHRs, EMRs, there are, radiology viewers. So there's a pathway to building products that use patient data. You obviously just need to be well versed with the laws in the geography and you're operating in. And in the US, that's HIPAA, and in Europe, that's GDPR. And by the way, HIPAA is like a self-certification. So it's not even something you get audited for. So you basically self-certify that, hey, I'm following all these rules that govern the use of patient data. And then when you sign a contract with a customer, you sign something called a BAA, which basically is an agreement saying that, yes, I'm actually HIPAA certified. So it's not a unsurmountable challenge by any means, but obviously something you have to be aware of.
Alessandro, maybe you can take this one if you want.
Yeah. So
especially considering your related insurance as well.
I would say, yeah, I think we also follow HIPAA, right? And as Shivam said, that wasn't a huge task, right? It's mostly having the right policies in place and making sure that also your vendors follow HIPAA. And I would say, obviously now India is moving with a lot of adoption of ABDM. And so that will have explicit mechanism for consent. Generally, that I would say is the key. Let's say we work a lot with insurers, of course, and they're obviously sharing some amount of de-identified data. And I imagine it's the same for hospitals is okay. But if you really want the more specific data, then there needs to be some layer of consent from the customer. And that is often, if you want to do things at scale, right, a little bit hard to get, right? So one thing that we do is that we try to reduce the readmission rate, because a big part of what we do is managed care. And in order to get the discharge summary, we need to make sure that the patient is in the loop, because obviously that contains a lot of sensitive information. And the discharge summary is where the key data is, right, for a given hospitalization. And so I think it depends also, though, on the policies that a given hospital or platform has in place, right? If they have a provision in the terms and conditions that says, look, I can use this for research purposes, then that's fine. Now, you don't need to go and ask every single user whether you can do that. But typically, it'll be more de-identified data. I think typically, at a high level, if you're okay working with de-identified data, you shouldn't struggle too much. If you need a lot more personal information, that's when it gets a bit tricky.
Got it. Last two questions, Dr. Sathya, this one's for you. This is a question on Ayushman Bharat and the health stack on the data part. It was supposed to solve for interoperability, has not had its UPI moment. So what exactly is happening on that front? Is adoption increasing from data providers like labs and hospitals? What has moved on ground?
I don't think I'm an expert on this, Nandini, so I'm going to defer to anybody else who...
Anyone else?
I can answer this a little bit. So I think we are seeing a lot of EMRs now offer that as a sort of a selling point, where they are already integrated with the latest stages of ABDM. Another one that's important is also maybe not talked about as much is the health exchange, the claims exchange, so the national NHCX. And that's also something where insurers are very keen to adopt it. The hospitals are going to be a little bit slower, but it's being baked into the HIS systems that they use. And so that's going to lead to more adoption on paper. The reality, though, is that you need some kind of use case, right? And typically, this is something that could be useful for patients, but realistically, patients are okay with often just details being shared over WhatsApp between clinicians, right? And so I'm not sure it actually solves a very immediate pressing pain point for the users, maybe just for the more privacy conscious users. And equally, hospitals have, to some extent, some benefit in making sure that the data that they have is proprietary. And so the thing that's a little bit tricky is getting, coaxing the various players in the ecosystem to have enough vested interest in, pushing the adoption, right? And I think that compared to UPI, which I think is a much more self-serving, platform, I think this will require a little bit more hand-holding and a little bit more push from the government to get that adoption, which I haven't yet seen being that widespread yet. But I think it's a great initiative, and it really does need to succeed. So it'll just take a little bit longer, maybe. It won't be quite as viral as UPI, but there's a lot of interest in making it happen. I think it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, that was my last question. Thank you so much. I just want to, we're almost at 7. Wanted to thank the 3 of you for coming here on a weekday, 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. Shivam, all the way from the US. Thank you so much for coming here and talking to us, Alessandro, Shivam, and Dr. Sathya. Reach out to you individually in the future sometime. And if any of our founders, almost all of you have other questions that we haven't taken up here. If any of our founders reach out to you on your LinkedIn or any other social network, send them our way. For all of you listening in, the Antler cohort applications are still open. We start the cohort on Feb 24th. The last date for applications is Jan 24th. Go ahead and apply. The team's looking forward to the applications. If I may add a pitch, we haven't done as many healthcare investments as we should. So if you're building in healthcare and if you're very early, want a co-founder, want to validate your idea, we might even be able to connect you to hospitals. 20% of the questions is, how do I get connected to hospitals? So we might be able to do that. So please apply for any questions, ping any of us on the Antler team on LinkedIn. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Shivam, Alessandro, and Dr.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.